Hey folks, George here again. Today we're going to examine one of the earliest Western philosophers, not exactly the earliest Western philosopher, but one of the earliest Western philosophers, Socrates. And we'll see how Socrates really influenced and really steered the direction of philosophy for, well, up to now, for the next 2,000 years or so. We're going to examine some of his ideas, see how some of his ideas are interesting, how we might engage with some of his ideas, and maybe even disagree or agree, as it were, right? Couple of quick notes about Socrates. The first is going to be that we only know about Socrates through ancient Greek writings, right? Mostly through his student, Plato. His student Plato wrote down most of what we know about Socrates and most of what we know about Socrates' ideas. He was written about by other writers in ancient Greece as well, sometimes not so flattering portrayal of Socrates, but Plato was his student, and Plato does portray Socrates in a more positive light and certainly tries to expound on some of his ideas. With that in mind, how might we discriminate or differentiate between the writings of Plato versus the ideas of Socrates? How can we say this is what Socrates thinks and this is what Plato thinks, and maybe they agree or disagree? I think there's a lot of philosophers who do engage with that question. I'm not going to engage with that question. I'm not terribly interested in that question, to be honest with you. I'm not interested in who the real Socrates is, or some other historians and literary scholars are really interested in the question of who is Homer, who is the real Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, I'm just not interested in those questions. There are a lot of people who are interested in those questions. Go pursue some of their ideas where you can really dive deep into that debate to really differentiate who the real figure is versus how they're portrayed in somebody else's writings. Here we're going to talk about Socrates, and I might later on use the name Plato interchangeably. That's how I'm going to use these ideas, at least. Some people will disagree with me. Please forgive me. Please forgive me. But that's how my perspective, my interpretation is going to go towards these sorts of ideas. Another idea to have in mind as we engage with these ideas of Socrates is how do we and other philosophers divide themselves in terms of how they look at reality and how they understand reality, right? On one hand, we're going to have some philosophers who are more relativist in nature. And the relativists will say that knowledge and truth is relative to whomever you are, whoever the culture is, right? And they will take a more subjectivist or individualist approach towards questions of reality and knowledge. My subjective belief is that this is the case, right? We would call that a subjectivist and to some degree a relativist, right? On the other hand, some philosophers are going to take a more absolutist and a more objectivist approach towards questions of reality and questions of truth and knowledge, right? And what will they say? Well, no, it's not mere subjective truth, but there is an objective truth somewhere out there about the nature of things, let's say, right? And those philosophers we'll call objectivists, right? That they take an objectivist position or an absolutist position sometimes, such that there is one answer to the question, this or that. What is the answer? An absolutist will say there is an absolute answer, not a relativist answer. So we'll contrast absolutism with relativism, right? Or, on the other hand, we'll contrast objectivism with subjectivism, right? Now, why am I saying all that? Because I hope we keep those questions, those demarcations, those labels in the back of our minds as we engage with the ideas of Socrates. What do I mean by that? What do you think Socrates' position on some issue is? Right? And I'll be honest with you, since ancient times, this has been up for debate, right? Since ancient times, there has been a really engaging debate about whether Socrates really believes in one objective truth, right? Or whether Socrates is more skeptically minded, such that he believes in some sort of subjective truth, right? And there's different reasons and different arguments given for these different interpretations regarding Socrates' own ideas and Plato's own ideas. Again, this goes all the way back to ancient times, where on both hands, philosophers will look back to Plato and Socrates and say, well, look, Plato and Socrates was an objectivist, were objectivists, therefore I am. Or, on the other hand, some philosophers will say, look, Plato and Socrates were relativists and subjectivists, therefore I am too, right? That's an interesting phenomenon, I think, how philosophers borrow the ideas of past philosophers and lead to different interpretations. We can go in different directions regarding the interpretations of the ideas that were espoused thousands of years ago, right? We'll see how that might play out here today when we engage with Socrates' work. The other distinction that we're going to have today, or that I hope we keep in the back of our minds, is the distinction between rationalist oriented philosophers versus empirical oriented philosophers. Rationalist philosophers believing that truth comes through reason and rational thinking and thinking inside, right? Versus empirically minded philosophers who are going to suggest that knowledge and how we discover truth about the world is going to come through our senses. What are these senses? Sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. Did I leave one out? I hope not. 5 or so, right? Yet the empirically minded philosophers are going to say that's how we get to real truth, is through the senses and through our sense experience, right? Again, let's keep those questions in the back of our minds as we engage with Socrates' ideas today. And as always here, I'm really engaging with this series on the introduction to philosophy. I'm really sticking with John Chafee's book, A Philosopher's Way, and how does John Chafee sort of organize some of our ideas. I like how he organizes the ideas in this particular discussion regarding Socrates. Later on, we'll see how I'm going to sort of butt heads with the way that John Chafee organizes his textbook. But here I am going to follow more or less some of the John Chafee's ideas and examine Socrates through John Chafee's lens, through John Chafee's perspective, through the textbook that John Chafee gives us. So with that in mind, I really like this section that John Chafee gives us called Socrates' central concern, that is, the soul. Socrates is centrally concerned with the soul and our soul and the betterment of our soul, right? Now, some of us are already going to push back a little bit and say something like, oh, but I don't believe in the soul. There is no soul. There is no such thing as a soul, as a disembodied soul, let's say. And therefore, I have to disagree with Socrates full stop already, if Socrates is concerned with the soul. What I'm going to ask us to do instead, right, and this is going to be a very important philosophical skill for us to pick up, is this to extend the philosopher that we're reading about, to extend that philosopher, to extend the reading that we're engaging with. A bit of charity, philosophical charity. That is, just try to give charity to these ideas. So even if you don't believe in the soul, I think that you could probably see that some of Socrates' ideas are still applicable to what is important to you. Socrates says the soul. Fine, if you don't believe in the soul, I think, how can we examine and interpret Socrates in a charitable manner such that his ideas are just as relevant to you, right? If you don't believe in this thing called a soul. And we will engage with that pretty soon too, right? What is this thing called a soul? What is this thing called a self? But let's table that discussion for a second now and just assume for a second that we can look at Socrates charitably and assume that there's something like this soul that he's talking about, right? And we'll see that I think it's very easy to adopt Socrates' ideas and engage with Socrates' ideas, whether you believe in an inner soul, an eternal soul, or something like that, right? However, I'm going to use, if you want to understand the word soul metaphorically, I think that works too, right? James Brown, for example, had a lot of soul, didn't he? What does that mean? Well, I think that's a metaphorical sort of use of the language, such that we could talk about how James Brown had a lot of, life or something like that, or a lot of spirit and a lot of gusto, however you might want to interpret that, right? And if that's how you want to use the word soul, if that use of the word soul works for you, please use that use of the word soul. Yeah, try to keep that in mind as we engage with Socrates here. And I really like this passage that John Chafee offers us, right, where we get to engage with Socrates' ideas and how he's presenting his ideas to the public. Because that's the interesting thing about Socrates. He's a public philosopher. He goes out into the public and engages with the public, right? Ancient Greece was slightly different from modern times, where people have these sorts of discussions in public. Well, actually, is that so different? I think that we do have these discussions in public sometimes. Very frequently I do. I very frequently will find myself at a coffee shop and just start to get into these interesting philosophical discussions with the patron at the coffee shop, right? Sometimes I'll be there with my friend, and people will come in and impose themselves onto the conversation because they say, wow, this is an interesting conversation. Can I listen in? And that's happened, at least to me, more than a few times, because I do think that we are interested in these questions, right? And so with that in mind, how does Socrates raise these questions to the public? Socrates tells somebody, you, my friend, a citizen of the great and mighty and wise city of Athens, are you not ashamed of heaping up the greatest amount of money and honor and reputation and caring so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? I really like that, because what Socrates is trying to remind us is that money and honor and all these sorts of things are probably not the most important thing in life, are they? Now, I don't think that Socrates is dismissing the value of money, but he's saying you pay no heed to the betterment of your soul, though. Shouldn't we pay more heed to these kinds of philosophical questions? And I think Socrates is right here, right? That we should pay more attention to these deeper questions. Yes, of course, we've got to pay attention to how will I pay rent? How will I feed myself and my children tonight? But at the same time, does that diminish the importance of questions like, am I living a good life? How shall I live my life to make it a good life? What lives are better than others? So these are some of the questions that we have here that I want to engage with today. Socrates' first quote that we're going to engage with and try to think about a little bit is this: the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. What does that mean? Well, I think what Socrates is trying to suggest is that he's encouraging us to think about our lives. Thinking is a very important part of life. He contrasts this with those who sleepwalk through life, or, to use a more modern idiom, those who merely go through the motions and don't really think about, wait, what am I doing here? Why should I be doing this? What would be better? Is this a good life or not? Socrates is encouraging us to think and examine our own lives. Now, I'll confess something to you. Philosophy and deeply thinking about these questions has led me to a lot of despair and, dare I say, some depression and some anxiety. By the way, I don't know about you, but I know that I've laid in bed it's always at 2 a.m. when all these great thoughts come to mind. Oh my goodness. Am I doing the right thing with my life? And staring at the ceiling in the dark. Oof. Yeah. Shouldn't we ask these questions, though, despite the fact that they do cause us some sort of distress sometimes and despair? Socrates is going to say, yes, absolutely we should, because it's going to lead us to a better life, ultimately. We have to wrestle with these hard questions. in order to thrive in the future. That might mean suffering through these questions right now. Well, consider this counter argument, though. I'm going to use another modern idiom here. Have any of you heard the phrase, ignorance is bliss? That seems to go exactly against Socrates' idea about the unexamined life is not worth living. Ignorance is bliss. Well, which one is it? Which one do you believe in a bit more? Ignorance is bliss. Here's my hunch. Now, I'm going to try to be charitable and try to respond with, how would Socrates respond to somebody who says, rubbish, Socrates, ignorance is bliss? Let's try to take a charitable interpretation and try to assume what Socrates might say in response to that. I think Socrates would say, wait a second, why are you able to say ignorance is bliss? In order to say ignorance is bliss, isn't that because you have actually thought about these questions? And in examining your life, you've come to the conclusion, ignorance is bliss. So you can't even say ignorance is bliss without examining your life. Right? Another counter to that counter that Socrates might offer us is, wait a second, yes, ignorance might seem like bliss. Right? I know that I myself think very frequently, oh my goodness, I would love to go back and live like a child again. Not have to pay bills, not have to pay rent, not have to go grocery shopping, not have to go work. I would love to live like a child again. I say that to myself very frequently, except, would I really? Would you really? And the bottom line for me, at least, is whenever I am treated like a child, I get a little bit upset. Hey, don't treat me like a child. I want to be free. I do want to go and do what I want with my life. Children don't get to do that. Ignorant people don't get to do that, do they? Right? Much later, utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill will say, it would be better, it is better, to be a miserable Socrates than a happy pig. And isn't that the kind of sentiment that Socrates is trying to remind us about? Would you really rather be a pig, just living in their own slop and being happy? Some of you might say yes. And Socrates is going to say, I'm not so sure. I don't think that life is quite worth living. Now, this is a question that you will have to engage with a little bit more. There's a lot more that we can say about this, but let's move on. Of course, people have been talking about Socrates for thousands of years. People have been talking about these ideas for thousands of years. I don't think we're going to get too, really down deep into many of them in this discussion. I'm not even sure an hour or 2 hours can really go deep into that one question. Is the unexamined life worth living? Socrates says no. Let us think, and thinking will will give us a much better life that is worth living. A second quote that Socrates gives us is, the truth is within all of us. The truth is within all of us. What he's really saying is, sit down and think, and you will get the answers to many of life's deeper questions. It is within you. You don't have to be told the truth. As a matter of fact, I just recounted that when people try to tell me how to live my life, I don't like it. Rather, I like to discover it myself by sitting down and thinking and contemplating about my life. And sooner than not, I will discover the truth. Even if I make a mistake, how do you know you've made a mistake? You can only make a mistake, and you can only evaluate it as a mistake if you know the truth inside of you already. Yeah? So even when you do make mistakes, you are applying Socrates' dictum that the truth is within you. Because how else do you know that you've made a mistake? But because, now I realize. And that's the key point. Now I realize. And Socrates wants to encourage us to think more about life and discover that truth that's already within us. A third quote that John Chafee gives us by Socrates is that we should strive for excellence in all areas of our life. Put your all into life, Socrates will suggest. Make full use of all of your gifts to live a good and honorable life. That's going to lead to a good life. Put everything you have into life. Don't go into things with a half-hearted effort. Because, of course, when you go in half-hearted, things are going to end up half-hearted. Rather, go in with your full life. Strive for excellence in order to live a good life. What might be a counter-argument to that suggestion? Well, here's an idea by G.K. Chesterton, who says, all things in life that are worth doing badly. After all, I like playing guitar, right? I like playing music. I'm not particularly good at that. I really am not. I'm not a good musician, unfortunately. However, isn't it worth being a bad musician? Because being a musician and engaging with music, that in and of itself is valuable, G.K. Chesterton will suggest. It's okay to be a bad musician. And by the way, I agree with this because I am a bad musician. It makes me feel better. Yeah, I'd rather be a bad musician than no musician at all. I understand music. I engage with music in a more interesting and in a more lively way. How might Socrates respond to this counter-argument? Well, isn't Socrates kind of saying the same thing, although it sounds like they are different? Yes, go into life and strive for excellence. Isn't the fact that I play music, despite the fact that I play music badly, isn't the fact that I just go into music at all a striving for excellence? Again, I'm trying to give a charitable interpretation to Socrates' ideas here. I might be wrong. Socrates might actually disagree with me, but Socrates has been dead for more than 2,000 years, so I can't ask him. All we can do is try to think charitably about what he might say. I don't know if you're going to buy what I'm trying to sell here, but that is one way, it seems to me, that a Socratic thinker might reply to Chesterton's quote here. Right? Now we'll go to this fourth quote that Chafee gives us by Socrates, which I think is probably one of the more controversial ones. Socrates says, "No one knowingly does evil." Is that the case? Well, before we get into counter-arguments, and I think we could already think of some quick counter-arguments. Before we get into those counter-arguments, let's really try to examine what Socrates is trying to say here when he says that no one knowingly does evil. What Socrates really means is, if you really think and you live a philosophical life and analyze the good life, you will lead a good life. If you really study and try to analyze and consider what is goodness, you will strive towards the true nature of goodness, according to Socrates. Right? What does that mean? Well, it seems to me that what that means is Socrates is saying that those people who do evil are just ignorant. They're ignorant of what a good life really is. Even those evil people who say, I think I'm doing good because this feels good. Socrates will respond and say, you're actually doing evil. You just don't know it because you are ignorant about what the good life really is and what goodness really is. If you really knew what goodness was, you would have no choice but to live goodness. Right? Now, obviously, the counterexamples are going to come flooding in. The Nazi Germans under Nazi Germany, they were some of the most educated people in history, in modern history. They knew their ethics. Nazi Germany, they knew their ethical studies. They studied their Plato. They studied their Aristotle and all of these ancient Greeks. They knew their philosophy, and especially their ethical philosophy. Yet they still did such terrible things. They did such terrible things. How can we connect that with Socrates' quote? Well, I think Socrates' only response to this, to give him a charitable reading, it would be, yeah, they may have studied ethics. They may have studied philosophy, yet they didn't really know it. They really didn't understand it. By the way, that does kind of resonate with me a bit, doesn't it? Because sometimes I'll study things just a little bit. Just a little bit. Does that really mean you understand it? And that's what Socrates or a Socratically minded thinker might respond to the counterexample of, let's say, the Nazi Germans, who were very educated, yet did such terrible evil. How does that sit with you? I'm not sure. I think that's a great that leaves great room for debate. The fifth quote that John Chafee gives us by Socrates is that it's better to suffer evil than to do evil. Socrates is going to try to put forward the idea that it's better to actually do good, that virtue and virtuous acts and doing virtue and doing good and knowing good, that is better, and that is the value in and of itself. Just doing good and being good. That's enough value for our lives. Full stop. We don't need the benefits, the, let's say, financial remuneration. We don't need rewards for doing good, if you really know what goodness is. As a matter of fact, sometimes, you tell me, I know that I, for myself, will say that sometimes I do good, and what happens? It'll bite you right in the rear sometimes, doesn't it? Somebody comes back and says something bad, despite the fact that I did good, right? And so Socrates is going to say, it's okay that that happens, because if you did good, that's virtue enough. That's the value enough in your life and for your soul. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like you need to be rewarded for the good that you do in the world? Yeah, some of us are going to say things like, listen, I don't do nothing unless I'm going to get paid for it, or something along those lines, right? Socrates is going to try to encourage us. Well, yeah, that's fine, but that's because you don't really know the value of goodness, right? Another example that I might give, a more modern example, is Martin Luther King Jr. He certainly did good. And what did the world do to him? He was killed for it. However, I believe, this is me speaking now, and I think that Socrates would agree, that Martin Luther King, despite the fact that he was killed, it was more worth it that he did the good that he did. That it was beautiful that Martin Luther King Jr. made the world a better place, despite the fact that some terrible people disagreed with him. The next section that I want to talk about regarding Socrates' way of thinking and his philosophical method is called the Socratic Method. And it is a method that really sticks with us in the Western world up to now. And I think it really does help to guide a philosophical thinking and more critical thinking, really, about anything, not merely philosophy, but really critical thinking about all sorts of different issues. Well, I'm going to be a little bit biased here and admit to you that I think all issues are philosophical issues in nature, really, especially when you get down deep. But I think you could approach, or rather, I think that you can apply this Socratic method to any sort of really important question. And in doing so, you are engaging with these important questions in your life in a Socratic manner, in a philosophical manner. John Chafee gives us a dialogue that Plato wrote between Socrates and another ancient Greek philosopher, Thrasymachus, right? And they're going to debate about the nature of justice. So the first step in the Socratic method is ask a question. Ask a question. And here the question is, what is justice. What is justice? Thrasymachus offers his own definition, his own answer to that question about what justice is. And Thrasymachus' answer is, justice is serving the interest of the stronger party. That's what justice is, according to Thrasymachus. So the first step was ask a question. The second step was answer the question, give a provisional answer to the question. Thrasymachus gives us a provisional answer. Justice is serving the interest of the stronger party. Now, the third step of the Socratic method is explain further what you mean. Serving the interest of the stronger party. What does that really mean? And Thrasymachus tries to explain his ideas a bit further. Well, he gives 3 examples. And I love that kind of philosophy where you can give more concrete examples about what you actually mean. And Thrasymachus says, consider 3 different types of government. Tyrannies, aristocracies, and democracies. Well, in a tyranny, which is a government that's led by a tyrant or a single ruler, you might say a dictator or a king too, justice is serving the interest of the tyrant. What sort of laws exist in tyrannies or in dictatorships or in absolute monarchies? Well, an example of this might be, this is George's example now, an example might be worship the king or worship the tyrant or worship my image. That serves the interest of the tyrant. The second example to help explain his idea that Thrasymachus gives is aristocracies. Well, what are aristocracies? Aristocracies are a small group of powerful people in a society, right? How are aristocratic laws formed that serve the group of the powerful in society? Well, some laws might be tax breaks for the rich, tax breaks for this aristocratic class. Or in other aristocracies, there might be a law that says corporations, small aristocratic elite groups called corporations, are actually people, and we should give them sort of free speech rights. That might be an aristocratic law, right? Thrasymachus gives us a third concrete example called a democracy. What are democracies? Well, democracies are the people rule, as opposed to aristocracies where a small class rules, or tyranny where one person rules. Democracy is the masses rule. And what are democratic laws? What are examples of democratic laws that serve the interest of all the people? Well, some laws might be freedom of speech in a democracy. Some laws might be equality of all people. Some law might be when you're brought to trial to face some criminal charge, you face a jury of your peers. Those might be democratic laws that serve the interest of all the people, right? Now, what's the fourth step of this Socratic method? Socrates is going to really examine and find certain problems with his examples, with Thrasymachus' examples, and even with Thrasymachus' definition now, right? And how does he do this? He asks a very specific question and a series of very interesting questions that logically lead to a contradiction, right? We'll talk about contradictions in a second. Socrates asks Thrasymachus, well, in your notion of justice, must subjects obey the ruler? Thrasymachus says, well, yes, obviously. That's what we mean by subject and ruler, right? Then Socrates throws a curveball and says, well, Thrasymachus, might it be the case that rulers make mistakes? Now, Thrasymachus is intelligent, right? And he knows that rulers are human, and humans make mistakes. So Thrasymachus has to say, yeah, I guess it can happen sometimes that rulers make mistakes. Then he asks, does that mean they can make mistaken laws? Right? Thrasymachus is going to say, well, obviously, right? If they're human and humans make mistakes, then rulers might make mistaken laws sometimes. But then, let me give you an example of a mistaken law. This is George's example now. what if I were the ruler and I see this person over there and I say, I really hate that person. And I hate that whole family of people over there. And you know what that family does? They all wear gray blazers, right? That might be a mistaken law as a tyrant. If I were a tyrant, I would say, kill everybody who wears gray blazers. I hope you see where the mistake is now and where Socrates is going to catch Thrasymachus in a self-contradiction. And he's going to say, well, obviously, then, if laws might be mistaken, if rulers might be mistaken about their own interests and make mistaken laws, what shall subjects do? You said, Thrasymachus, subjects should always obey the ruler. Well, when my subjects come up to me, George, and I say, kill everybody with a gray blazer, what should the subjects do? Should they serve the interests of George, of the ruler, and not kill me? He says, clearly they should serve my interest, and my interest is not to be killed. But at the same time, Thrasymachus said, wait a second, subjects shall always obey the rulers. So should they kill me or not? There's part of the argument that says, yes, kill George, because always obey the ruler, that says kill people with gray blazers. But then there's the part of Thrasymachus' definition, of Thrasymachus' argument, that says justice is serving the interest of the ruler, and it's not in my interest to be killed. So it clearly leads to a contradiction. Kill George. Both Thrasymachus' argument says both kill George and don't kill George. That's a self-contradiction. That's going to be one of the greatest sins in philosophical argument. Don't contradict yourself. Because when you do contradict yourself, you talk nonsense. You show that you're talking nonsense. And that your argument is ultimately nonsense when there's a self-contradiction in there that says both kill George and don't kill George. So Thrasymachus' idea about justice collapses to nonsense. And therefore, we have to keep going and go back to the beginning. What is justice? Thrasymachus gave us a response to what is justice. Thrasymachus' idea about justice, though, leads to a self-contradiction. Now what? Now, in real life, how do we deal with self-contradictions? Right? Sometimes we have to go back. Thrasymachus might have to go back and change some of his argument so that it doesn't lead to a contradiction. What part of the argument do you think Thrasymachus should change in order for him to not contradict himself? I think that's an interesting room. There's a lot of interesting ideas that can be examined in that question. I don't want to do that right now. We're not here today to save Thrasymachus' argument. But I think that is an interesting way, because after all, shouldn't we be charitable? If I said be charitable to Socrates, let's try to be charitable to Thrasymachus too. How might Thrasymachus change his definition or his argument, or how he answered some of Socrates' questions? I'm not sure. Why don't you guys give it a stab, yeah? So what does all of this show? Right? Why talk about Socrates in the way that I just did here? Well, what I love is that Socrates shows us that we really have to, as critical thinkers, as philosophical thinkers, as philosophers, we have to clarify our ideas. That's why Socrates' ideas are so interesting. Not necessarily because you might believe every single idea that he tries to put forward, but rather the method of Socrates' thinking. That is, shouldn't we clarify our ideas and have clear ideas about what we mean when we talk? Another interesting aspect of Socrates' thinking is that he goes out into the public and asks for multiple perspectives. Thrasymachus, what do you think about justice? Interesting, let's talk about this. Maybe that doesn't work. Now we have to think about some other notion of justice. Right? So getting multiple perspectives is an important philosophical skill. Discovering and thinking about these questions to see where our ideas take us. What are the logical entailments of our ideas? Well, we saw with Thrasymachus that the logical entailments of his ideas are self-contradiction. So therefore, Thrasymachus has to go back, we hope, and clarify his ideas. Oh, wait, I need to clarify my ideas. I need to fix my ideas so that they don't logically lead to a self-contradiction or something else that I don't like. What I really love about Socrates' public philosophy is that he expresses his ideas out loud. Why? Because expressing your ideas out loud, I might be wrong. Help me. Help me. I'm asking you to help me clarify my own ideas. And that while it does take a lot of courage to acknowledge, hey, I was wrong. I think that's a very interesting and important philosophical insight that I've developed is, yeah, I might be wrong. Sorry, I was wrong. Let's fix that. And expressing and debating your ideas publicly allows you to clarify your ideas and engages with other people's ideas. And what does that all mean? That we have to revise our beliefs sometimes. God forbid, yes, sometimes you change your mind. That's okay. I love Winston Churchill, right? When challenged and says, wait, didn't you change? Isn't that something that you said, doesn't that contradict something you said before? And he said, yeah, I change my mind when I learn new things. What do you do? Right? And in that way, I love how Socrates really teaches us, and he serves as a model of a critical thinking philosopher. Right? One last comment about the nature of all of this, especially since we don't get a lot of answers here. And I want to clarify this a bit. I don't like the word opinions. Now, of course, fundamentally, I'm okay with the word opinions. But I don't like how it's used so much in our society. What do I mean by that? Because so frequently people will say, oh, that's just your opinion. What does it mean when you say, that's just your opinion? I think what that means is that you've got your opinion, I've got my opinion, let's not talk about it. You're going to come to your conclusions, I'll come to my conclusions. I'll be honest with you. If that's the way you treat opinions, I'm not concerned about opinions. I don't care about your opinion. And in philosophy, I don't really care much about other people's opinions. What I do care about is other people's well-reasoned beliefs and well-reasoned arguments. I want to hear your arguments. Share with me your reasons for your beliefs. And let's engage with these reasons and see if we can come to similar or different beliefs. And so that's going to be the whole point here, for me at least. It hurts my soul when I hear people say, oh, that's just your opinion. Because it shows that you're not even listening to me. You're not trying to engage with my reasons for my beliefs, my arguments for my positions. Because what do they say? Opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got them and they all stink. So I don't want to hear opinions. I want to hear well-reasoned arguments and well-reasoned beliefs about some issue or another. And let's talk about our reasons for believing different things. And I think Socrates serves as a model to help us engage with other people, with the world around us in that way. See you next time. Bye-bye.